Okay, 大家好, ni hao. I'm so happy to be here. I was just saying thank you to everybody at PAM for inviting me, to Rebecca, to Christina for all the amazing arrangements, and to Bethany, the director. It's really a thrill to be here and to share my research with you today. And I hope that in the spirit of the lunchbox conversation, we can keep this casual. I can talk for hopefully no longer than a half hour. And then I'm really looking forward to opening it up to questions and conversation. And feel free to be eating as you watch and good, excellent. I know it's lunch breaks for many. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you now. Here we go. Okay, so today I want to talk about, the title of my talk is Repicturing Global China, Contemporary Art from Shanghai to Los Angeles. And I'm going to share with you research from my book that came out last year with Manchester University Press, and it's Rethinking Art's Histories series, Above Sea, Contemporary Art, Urban Culture, and the Fashioning of Global Shanghai, which looks at contemporary art, design, architecture, and urban culture created in and about the city of Shanghai. And then I'm also going to tell you about some more recent projects I've done, including an exhibition entitled Picturing Global China, and also my current project, Another Beautiful Country, Moving Images by Chinese American Artists, which will wind us back to Los Angeles. And I'll share some of that research as well. All right, so I'm starting in the city of Shanghai, and I think many of you put which city you're tuning in from, but if you can add it again in the chat, that would be fantastic. And also, if you can let me know if you've been to Shanghai, just say, Shanghai in the house, and that would be great. But for those of us who haven't, or those of you who haven't been there, I'll just give you a little sneak peek of how it tends to be presented in mainstream media outside of Shanghai through the international medium of cinema. Oops, I hope if I can, there we go. Here we see James Bond taking a dip along the Huangpu River area. And you see on the one side, the Bund, and the other side, the Lu Jiazui skyline. So even if you aren't familiar with the city of Shanghai, you've probably seen these images of the city before. The city has long been known as the People's Republic of China's most so-called East meets West metropolis. And today, especially at the first 2 decades of the 21st century, it has also been repositioned as a global capital, cultural capital of the world, and featured in films such as Skyfall 007 from 2012. An old-fashioned relative of today's global buzzword, the trope of East meets West still abounds in discussions of Shanghai and the burgeoning field of modern and contemporary Chinese art. In my book, I explore how aesthetizations of the East meets West trope often construct globalizing, glamorizing artifices that mask Shanghai's underlying cross-cultural conflicts, rooted in vying notions of foreign-influenced modernity versus anti-colonialist nationalism, as well as the city's repressed Maoist past versus consumerist present. The name of Shanghai literally translates into English as above sea, suggesting a space above borders and cultural divides. As my studies show, to occupy such a position above sea, despite its implications of freedom, requires a precarious balancing act. One particular neighborhood in Shanghai, in its former French concession, serves as a central locational thread in my book. Today, the neighborhood houses Xintiandi, which translates into New Heaven on Earth, an outdoor shopping mall and pseudo-architectural preservation complex said to epitomize East meets West and old meets new Shanghai. Seemingly ironically, Xintiandi literally sprung from China's communist roots. The historic site of China's first Communist Congress, held in 1921, now memorialized as a museum, sits sandwiched between Xintiandi's tomorrow, its modern block, dominated by a glass-clad shopping mall, cinema, boutique hotel, and souvenir stalls, and yesterday block, comprising the complex's signature terrain of partially preserved and mostly reconstructed Longtang and Shikumen, which are Shanghai's vernacular semi-colonial era alleyways and stone gate homes. I see my friend John Alexander coming in. And those house upscale boutiques, gourmet restaurants, and multinational chains like Starbucks. To many outside observers, this oh, sorry, if you could again just mute yourselves while I speak. Thank you. To many outside observers, this arrangement marks a striking paradox. A memorial to the origins of Chinese communism stands amidst a consumerist mecca made possible through cutthroat development. Xintiandi's construction destroyed hundreds of original Shikumen homes and displaced over 8,000 working class residents. For numerous Chinese studies scholars, however, the coexistence of free market capitalism and China's Communist Party rule is not thought of as inherently paradoxical, but as China's post-1989, post-socialist reality. Throughout my book, I reveal that this sort of cover-up in which East meets West style masks social, political, and economic collisions or unexpected power formations, such as the hybridizing of China's communist bureaucracy with global capitalism, is not new or particular to Xintiandi. Such obfuscations have persisted since Shanghai's semi-colonial era, when the city was carved up into British, French, American, and Japanese-run districts. In the 1920s to 30s, Lu Xun, revolutionary writer and founder of the woodcut movement, the revolutionary woodcut movement, promoted art that exposed the racism and inequities that were plaguing Shanghai. One such work, Avenue Joffre, pictures the economic disparities and foreign/local divides rampant on the city's high streets of Shanghai's French concession near present-day Xintiandi. Avenue Joffre depicts a busy urban scene, showing twisted trees recalling the imported London plane trees lining the avenues of Shanghai's French concession, and a woman with a hardened stare in the foreground. A foreign policeman impulsively throws someone in a truck, while an overstuffed man carrying a parcel stands idly in the background, a destitute mother and child behind him. A scrawny boy with torn clothing and two ragtag dogs are juxtaposed against a portly foreigner and a store sign advertising sale in English. The Chinese boy appears more closely aligned in scale to the dogs near his side than the foreigners who are free to play and consume in this uneven city. It is an oft-cited racist exclusion of Chinese people from Shanghai's foreign-run parks, seen in an early placard placed outside the International Settlement's Bund Park stating "No Chinese," excluding Chinese servants of foreigners, and "No dogs." Cai Hong's cacophonous sketch reveals the injustices lurking below Avenue Joffre's material allures. Indeed, the neighborhood just south of Avenue Joffre comprised a hotbed of evolution and revolutionary art activity. A side street near the first communist meeting housed an intensely monitored gathering spot for Shanghai's activists and studio of China's first self-proclaimed avant-garde art and design collective, the Storm Society, which was founded by Parisian-educated painter Peng Shuanqin, standing here in the white robe in the back, together with Japanese-educated modern painter and poet Ni Yide, standing beside him in the back. Through depictions of Shanghai and a Bauhaus-inspired advocacy of the merging of art and life through design, Peng Shuanqin helped to develop Republican Shanghai's unique cross-cultural and multimedia artistic style, which was referred to as Hai Pai. Peng Shuanqin's watercolor, such as Shanghai, also entitled The Riddle of Life, integrates artistic tactics culled from French surrealism, such as the transformation of everyday objects into occult symbols and the creation of a diaphanous oniric tableau. The watercolor also fashions a multivalent landscape particular to Shanghai by layering imagery associated with the city's reputation as China's most cosmopolitan and vice-ridden metropolis. Along with brothels and opium dens, game rooms by the early 1930s housed one of Shanghai's most characteristic and ubiquitous vices. Existing between fantastical and nightmarish landscapes, the latter made manifest in a chain of bondage bordering the woman in the bottom right, and a dagger that seems to plunge into a dismembered body form at the top. Pang Shenqin's watercolor, situated as if a playing card, characterizes Shanghai's modern foreign-influenced culture as glamorous and enticing on one side and menacingly sinister on the other. See if I can play this for you. Okay, so these here that you're going to see are the opening credits to the 1936 film Street Angel by left-wing director So here we see overlapping urban scenes flashing in rapid succession, neon signs in English and Chinese, birds flying over the city, people strolling in a park, moviegoers, a band on parade, churches' pointy spires, fireworks, dance halls, crowded trams, bright street lamps, the neoclassical customs house, and the chief symbol of Shanghai's imported capitalism, a pair of bronze lions flanking the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation on Shanghai's front. Stood as a symbol, as I said, of imported capitalism, imported by the British and Americans under colonialism, and located right in the heart of the international settlement, which was run by the British and the United States. Following the montage, the camera fixates on a gleaming white Art Deco skyscraper that's filmed from top to bottom before plunging underground, and the subtitles, "The Slums of Shanghai," appear. The story, Street Angel, tells of a young woman, Xiao Hong, who nearly falls victim to Shanghai's seedy underworld when her greedy landlords threaten to sell her off to mobsters. Xiao Hong's good working class neighbors finally save her, but her older sister, a presumed prostitute, ends up stabbed. Representing the city's modern cosmopolitan architecture as rooted in destitute poverty, Street Angel sharply departs from the popular myths of Shanghai as a site of harmonious East meets West encounters. East meets West myths were forcefully resurrected in the 1990s at sites such as Xintiandi and elsewhere in Shanghai as officials positioned the city as an international financial and cultural capital. Since the early 1990s, the Chinese government has invested in dozens of contemporary art museums and galleries and creative zones, often with East meets West themes. Numerous artists have since created works contributing to and or critiquing the recent global positioning of Shanghai, such as Gu Wenda's Heavenly Lantern Project, a proposal to cover Pudong's Jinmao Tower in red Chinese lanterns as a celebration of East meets West harmony, and Xu Bing's Tobacco Project, which more critically draws parallels between the historic tobacco trade between China and especially Shanghai and the United States and contemporary art exchange. The 2010 Shanghai World Expo marked what cultural anthropologist Weiwei has deemed China's most explicit demonstration yet of a can-do determination to experiment with cutting-edge innovations in architecture and design. Following the event's conclusion, two main Expo sites, the China Pavilion and the Urban Future Pavilion, were turned into now the largest Chinese state-run museums devoted to modern and contemporary art. the China Art Palace and the Power Stations of Art. During the Expo, a number of China's most well-known artists and designers were commissioned to produce sculptures for Shanghai-based art star Zhang Huan, who got his start doing abject body performances in the outskirts of Beijing in the mid-1990s, exhibited these two giant stainless steel pandas, He He and Xie Xie, which were said to celebrate international peace and harmony in an East meets West style. Zhang Huan is known for employing over 100 laborers in a factory-like studio on the outskirts of Shanghai to produce his large-scale sculptures that Zhang Huan's and other artists' East meets West encounters often exist less in the artist's superficial appropriation of Chinese symbols and more in the outsourcing of labor, overseen by the artists, like so many heads of global manufacturing companies utilizing inexpensive labor in China, the so-called world's factory. In response to the Expo, the artist Cai Guoqiang, in his concurrent exhibition, Peasant Da Vinci's, which on construction site on the Bund side of the Huangpu River, Nongming Rongcheng Shi Geng Mei Hao, which translates to peasants making a better city, a better life, and riffed off the official World Expo slogan, which was better city, better life, trying to call attention to the often unrecognized migrant labor that fueled Shanghai's rapid development. Despite Cai Guoqiang's critiques and celebration of peasants, he has also become an art star in his own right. He's currently based in New York City and also has done projects internationally. And he's also done a number of collaborations with the Chinese government, including the opening and closing fireworks for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And in 2001, a firework display extravaganza celebrating the APEC conference, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. And I'll just show you a little bit of those as I continue on. So it was commissioned by APEC, which is a multi-government-led economic forum devoted to free trade and accelerated business policies. It comprised nearly 20 minutes. I'll just show you a clip of some, featuring these fireworks that erupted from numerous launching points along the Huangpu River, showcasing both Shanghai's historic and present-day landmarks of world city status. The Colonial Bund on one hand and the Pudong skyline, China's shining symbol of exponential post-socialist economics. As you can see, the dazzling display featured a myriad of references, including cosmic forms and signifiers of traditional Chinese culture, red lanterns, boats adorned with dragons, and the fireworks themselves, the artist's signature medium and famously 7th century Chinese invention. Cai Guoqiang's promoters frequently point to the artist's incorporation of these motifs and his use of fireworks in celebrating his ability to blend Chinese mythology with individualistic creation and Eastern tradition with Western art styles such as land art. But the identification of traditional Chinese cosmological symbols, which has largely dominated the discussion of this artwork and of Cai Guoqiang's practice more generally, elides the significance of APEC's command's massive cultural explosion over China's key financial centers. So this was staged on October 20th, just over a month following the collapse of New York City's World Trade Center on September 2001. And the work, especially the grand finale, which you see in the moment, consisting of a stimulated eruption of Shanghai's Oriental Pearl radio TV tower, constituted an uncanny projection of China's rising economic might in the face of this collapse. Official Chinese reports announced that Shanghai's convening at the 2008 Olympics was an appropriate signal of China's economic might, despite appeared on a government website. For the host, the only country in the Asia-Pacific region to enjoy rapid economic growth, the success of APEC 2001 in Shanghai signifies the further integration of China into globalization and its increasingly important role in the movement. So yeah, sorry for the cacophonous sound, but that gives you a sense of the chaos and excitement exploding over the Huangpu River. Basically, I was just saying that often the argument that's around, or the celebration of the artwork is very much about these East meets West symbols that are present, the fire-breathing dragons, the red lanterns, the fireworks themselves, without really taking into account that this also is a major symbol of China's rising economic might and the collaboration between government, individual artists, private interests towards this massive fireworks display that's happening just in the aftermath of 9/11 in the United States and the economic downturn outside of China. So, while slowed by the global pandemic, the positioning of global contemporary art and design up until recently reverberated not only in Shanghai, where it continues to flourish today, but also in cities around the world. Elected and promoted abroad by figures including Sir David Tang, who had Christian, a collaboration between Liu Jianhua and Christian Dior. He creates art that addresses globalization in Chinese conventional craft. In his sculptural series, Daily Fragile, Liu Jianhua presents and engages the dynamics of globalization and China's rapid rise as the world's primary producer and consumer of mass-produced goods. It comprises thousands of porcelain objects that resemble commodities, from milk cartons, handbags, high-heeled boots, baseball caps, soda bottles, etc., which become assembled onto large-scale installations that cover entire gallery floors, sometimes creeping up onto the walls. Liu emphasizes the fragility of porcelain, which he further accentuates in other pieces by smashing the works to pieces. It conjures China's formerly colorless objects appear capable of churning out more and more things at ever increasing rates, while simultaneously registering the fragility of commodity culture's illusions of stability, permanence, and undying pleasure. Maintaining a studio in Shanghai, Liu Jianhua produces these sculptures in his hometown of Jingdezhen, China's historic capital of porcelain production for over 1,000 years. He is one of many artists to do so. Most well known amongst others is Weiwei, who in 2010 commissioned the hand-painted production of 100 million hand-painted porcelain sunflower seeds from ceramic producers in the town of Jingdezhen. By maintaining a workshop in Jingdezhen, collaborating with local artisans whose skills have been mostly entirely rendered obsolete by globalization and the made in China phenomenon, and others left out eastern coastal cities like these methods might initially appear to follow Mao Zedong's directive to artists to go out among the masses of workers, or else to mimic the more recent outsourcing operations of multinational corporations. But by insisting on highly skilled artisanal labor and working with porcelain, a craft the artist honed over decades of study, Liu Jianhua reverses this logic of mass production and reinvigorates Jingdezhen's artisan-based economy that has suffered both under the extremism of the Cultural Revolution, as well as in the face of China's subsequent rise as the world's factory. And Liu Jianhua has done a number of other critical pieces critiquing the mechanisms of globalization. Here's one from 2007 that was displayed in the Shanghai Gallery of Art, Expo Cargo Transit, in which he in which he utilized garbage that had been imported from so-called more developed nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, into China, plastics, et cetera, for disposal. And he repackaged them as art and labeled them art export, sculptures and paintings, and encouraged foreign buyers, especially from Western nations, to collect these works while discouraging Chinese buyers so they would re-enter back as artworks into the Western countries from whence they came. This was accompanied by appalling statistics about the environmental degradation caused by the importation of trash by China from Western nations, which has since stopped in more recent years, and the massive enormity of the situation. All right, so finally, Liu Jianhua is shown, as you know, if you've seen the cover of my book and the talk, his photograph, Unreal Scene, is gracing the cover of my book. And I also included him in this exhibition I want to briefly talk about called Picturing Global China. So Picturing Global China came out of a seminar that I taught when I was at the University of Oregon. And it was on contemporary Chinese art. And me and the students invited people through our connections at art institutions, through universities and museums and galleries, as well as using social media platforms like Weibo and WeChat to reach out to people to send us their photographs of global China. And the results that we got were really amazing. And they were from all over China, and they were created by artists, photojournalists, people from all walks of life. And I'll just show you really quickly what the exhibition looked like. And later I produced this bilingual catalog with my partner, graphic designer Henry Willem Lucas at UCLA. And these are the installation shots. And you can see some of the images here that really gave us a very nuanced understanding of China and all of its multi-faces. This is a photograph by Gu Zheng of Shanghai. We have punk festivals on the outskirts of Beijing, cattle farmers in Henan province, Yunnan province village, Xinjiang, a project in Xinjiang by artist Patty Chang, my colleague at Roski School. John Alexander, who I think is here in the house. Yes, yes. He had a Fulbright to be creating photographs in and around the Three Gorge area in Chongqing. I love these ones. They're of a Communist Party member taken in the Politburo. Very kind of small details of everyday office life. Yeah, and all around. So really kind of incredible. And they ended up debunking this whole notion of a global China, or certainly that there's one kind of single unified narrative of China. And finally, my latest project, I just want to share, is one of the artists that's included in Picturing Global China. That was the artist Patty Chang, as I mentioned, my colleague and USC's Roski School. So I'm going to be shifting now and looking at Chinese American artists and their contributions and how they think about, imagine China not as a single unified entity, but rather as a transcultural construct, intersectionally, with a lot of nuance, and explore gender and sexuality issues within transcultural construct of Chinese American cultural identity. So this really briefly is her project, The Product Love, which reenacts a meeting, reimagines a meeting that took place between the German philosopher Walter Benjamin and the Chinese American actress Anna May Wong. Benjamin later penned this essay, Interview with Anna May Wong, a chinoiserie out of the Old West. He uses a lot of orientalizing and kind of, and Patty Chang teases that out as she creates this video artwork that looks at the issues of translation, as well as imagining a softcore pornography scene between them evolve. In my new project, I reclaim these historical figures like Anime Wong, the first who in many ways was harmed by the anti-miscegenation laws and anti-Asian racism that existed in her time and continues to persist in Hollywood and in Los Angeles and in the United States at large. And I look at the way she's influenced subsequent artists, including Patty Chang, as well as the artist Charlene Liu. So just conclude really briefly with Charlene Liu's series, prints, which feature images of qi paos, Chinese traditional Chinese dresses. And Liu explains that what she did was take photographs of details of qi paos, and then she digitally manipulated them and drew patterns of bronze mirrors and other ancient Chinese motifs over them. She thought of this process as speaking to translation, loss in translation, cultural transfer, illusion, and optical and cultural flattening. She embraces the streaks, blurs, and impurities that accompany silk screens while mixing personal references and historical motifs, unraveling the myths of a monolithic Chinese or Chinese American culture, and inviting viewers to meditate on our own positionality and cross-cultural familial histories. So finally, I'd just like to conclude with some of my own personal familial history, because I actually lent Charlene Liu some of the qi paos that once belonged to my grandmother. I brought them here for show and tell. You can see, and she photographed these dresses, and then she utilized them in her silkscreen prints. So my grandmother, Shu Yinlin, coincidentally, like Patty Chang's grandmother, whom she knew, migrated to Taiwan from Wenzhou in mainland China around 1949. For months and my grandfather, and only my grandmother, because she could speak Taiwanese, would venture into public. Eventually, the family settled into life in Taiwan, where my grandmother helped design and acquire dozens of qi paos that she would later take with her on a new migration to the United States. Tailored qi paos are very personal objects, but like so much art, they come from an intricate web of external craftsmanship, institutional supports, economic exchanges, historical and socio-political conditions, personal narratives, and varied designs. And in some cases like these, qi paos move across oceans and are passed down through generations, even having their image circulated through artworks. Exploring such cross-cultural art and design offers ways of illuminating Chinese and Chinese American culture as an ever-shifting transcultural construct, reflected and envisioned in digitally manipulated photographs such as these, hand-drawn bronze mirrors, or the intricate patterns of qi paos themselves, which continue to be worn today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm really excited to take your questions. Sorry, I did go a bit over, so I hope we still have plenty of time for questions. So please shoot away into the chat, and I'll be happy to expand on some of these.
Great. Thank you again, Jenny. So yeah, please shoot your questions into the chat box. It should be in the middle of your screen below Jenny's image.
Oops. If there are no questions, I would like to also invite you actually to explore this website that I made last year together with USC Chinese Studies librarian Tong Li and I. We organized together with a group of amazing curatorial students this exhibition on Scalar. You can check it out through USC's libraries. It's called In a Bronze Mirror, Chang's life and literature, and it features special collections materials of Eileen Chang, which are housed at USC's libraries, as well as materials from PAM, including qi paos, which they have in their collection there at the Pacific Asia Museum. So I just wanted to share that all with you as well. Let's see, what are my candid thoughts on Ai Weiwei, says Elizabeth Goodyear. So one thing, if you know a little bit about contemporary Chinese art, or even if you don't, probably the only big name that you know is Ai Weiwei. And you know, he has come to international prominence, and as you know, he's pretty much been banned from China or has self-selectedly left after having been imprisoned there. He often makes works that are very critical of the Chinese government. What I find most interesting to think about in relationship to him is his backstory. So for those of you who don't know it, just briefly, I'll share that his father was a very famous modernist poet named I Ching. And during the Cultural Revolution, which was from 1966 to 1976 in China, an extremist movement, rightist and sent exiled into Xinjiang for a decade and forced to clean toilets and not write poetry at all. And Ai Weiwei grew up in that scenario. And then following the Cultural Revolution, Ai Qing was pardoned by the Chinese government and welcomed back into Beijing and given a very high-ranking position as a cultural minister. So I find that interesting and illuminating in thinking about how aware Ai Weiwei is of government and the way it can swing back and forth in China, and how he's, you know, strategically utilized that and his critiques of the government towards his own artistic prominence. Let's see if I can see some of the others. When it comes to the many contemporary art museums you showed, I was wondering who is funding them. From Thomas O'Leary, are they state or privately funded? Excellent question, Thomas, thank you. They are both, but many of them I showed, such as the China Pavilion turned China Art Palace and the new Urban Futures Pavilion from the World Expo turned Power Station of Art. Those two are government funded by both local Shanghai government with investments from Beijing. And then there's other museums such as the Rockbund Art Museum that's privately funded, I believe founded by a Taiwanese businessman. The Shanghai Art Gallery that's located there on the Bund, that's a private one as well. But as you know, oftentimes in China, private enterprises must have a partner, a governmental partner and support. So there are still partnerships that exist. How free are artists to express themselves politically in Shanghai, China today? From June Lee. Thank you, June, for that question. It depends on the artists that you speak to. I think, you know, if you're making something that's about very sensitive topic, such as Taiwan independence or Tibetan movements or Xinjiang issues, you will not have any freedom to express yourselves in China, within mainland China. They're very strictly control the content. They also very strictly control content in terms of sexuality and bodies. Naked bodies are not frequently shown. However, many young people and artists know ways around those systems. So there will be you know, using, what do we use? Sorry, when we, if you're away from USC, but you can use a kind of proxy way of signing on to the internet.
I'm not sure.
It's called, yeah, anyways, there's ways where you can trick the internet to not know that you're signing on from China. It may route you through another way. And young people who are educated or working in these cultural fields often know those kinds of workarounds. And art itself remains relatively under the radar. So let's say less so than a big mainstream media such as film, commercial film, movies, that kind of thing, which can very easily be censored. Within the arts, oftentimes, you know, the audiences are relatively smaller, and a show might get shut down, but it can also be up for a certain amount of time before it is shut down. Again, you can use social media channels to get it out there. So I think people are quite aware of ways of navigating the system and freely expressing themselves. But also, if you're making work that is not directly political, you will have quite a bit of freedom. and support, I would say. There's quite a bit of governmental support, official support for artists these days. When it comes to the many contemporary, okay, so let's see. Yes, thank you, Rebecca, for sending the USC PAM online exhibition page link to everybody. Please do check out In a Bronze Mirror. Through thought is back very much highlighting the amount of kids who died. Okay, back to Elizabeth Goodyear. Oh, VPN, thank you. Yes, a VPN. The kids know. Elizabeth Goodyear, back to Ai Weiwei question. His backpack project that he did following the really tragic earthquake in Sichuan province, in which exposed a lot of shoddy construction, kind of corruption that had happened in relationship to construction there, including most tragically in schools. And a lot of school children died when following the earthquake, or because of the earthquake, the construction collapsed on them. And so Ai Weiwei did this project you may know about, where he did an installation of backpacks numbering the amount of children who had died in the earthquake. And also he really tried to illuminate their names, to just find out who they were and publish the list so that people could see the sheer quantity of people and also remember them and honor them as individuals, which at the time, because the government was really embarrassed about the whole thing and trying to keep quiet, was banned within China. He was beat up, Ai Weiwei, probably in some kind of, unofficial but official capacity. And yeah, I think that kind of a project is really enlightening, and it is really, as Elizabeth says, and is really important work to be doing as an artist, yes. Okay, Hu Jiao Wang says, hi, Jenny, thank you for the super informative session. Thank you. I used to live in Jing'an district of Shanghai great years. One of the criticisms from the perspectives of some older Chinese regarding modern China is that it's losing its cultural identity to rapid economic development. What is your view on this? Thank you. Thank you, Hu Jiao Wang. I couldn't agree with you more. I feel it's a great tragedy that so much of the distinctive local culture is being lost. And, I think Xintiandi is kind of a perfect example of that, although it also is very multi-sided, because Xintiandi is one of the rare projects that does kind of insist on preserving the local culture, although it was done, as I mentioned, very superficially, with actually demolishing many of the existing shokumen homes and then recreating these facades in what is, by other critics, been called a Disneyland stage set. But it did help to spur a architectural preservation movement. So the neighborhood that's around Xintiandi is one of the best preserved in the city of Shanghai. So it had that. And I think it did kind of instill a sense of pride in local traditional vernacular that maybe helped also newer generations to appreciate that history. So I know a lot of younger people who are involved in design and arts that are in Shanghai that are looking to move into those kinds of homes and renovate them, and are really take great pride to honoring those earlier moments and times and designs today. Did you want to add anything, Hu Jiao, or does that answer your question?
I think we have time maybe for one more, and then that would bring our program to a close. I think we have one more question from Thomas.
Yeah, one more question. Great. From Thomas. Thank you so much. A lot of the images and information about Shanghai seem to be filtered through the official narrative Beijing wants to present to the world. How much do you think that accurately represents how people in Shanghai see themselves? How much, if any, do local officials have in making cultural decisions, given the degree of censorship coming out of Beijing? Thank you very much, Thomas. That's a wonderful question and a great one to think about and conclude on. So I take the World Expo as a prime example of thinking about the official narrative, right? Xi was a really shiny red lacquer pagoda-like structure. This is what has now become China Art Palace, the museum. And it's inverted, so it's kind of upside down, turned on its head. And that's the official narrative that Beijing wants to project to the world, is this, shiny, new structure that also is harkening back to, pre-modern China and is very much rooted in Chinese tradition. At the same time, within China, amongst, at least amongst artists, intellectuals, people that I was in dialogue with in Shanghai, they critiqued this particular structure for being precisely the antithesis of that overblown projection. They talked about it, since it's inverted, they talked about it as being the perfect symbol of a China which projects a very strong, boastful kind of a presence on the world stage, when in fact the infrastructure was not steady enough to support this giant, bombastic image. Many people who I spoke with in Shanghai, from taxi drivers to professors, lambasted the Expo, saying that it was a waste of money. It was an event they themselves could not afford to attend amidst pressing ecological, environmental, and issues, as well as the rising gap between workers, migrant workers in particular, versus the wealthy in Shanghai. They thought that this was, not where the government should be investing its not the place where the government should be prioritizing and putting its investments. And there's also a number of artists, and I think the Picturing Global China project brought that to the fore so well, like John Alexander, who's here. Thank you for your work, and Chongqing, and kind of just showing us a much more quotidian, everyday reality of what's on the ground in these places. There's another well-known photography collective called Birdhead, Niao Tou, who took a lot of photographs during the construction for the 2010 World Expo, which caused also, and again, relocation of people that was forced. And so there's a lot of photographs they take, for example, of demolished buildings, and then the great billboard showcasing what the Expo will look like and what it will bring. But it's all these kinds of bombastic dreams that are not necessarily what people are feeling on the ground. So does that answer your question, Thomas? And also, thank you. And also I see Hu Zhao says, some of the restoration done in Shanghai and some other parts of China, including my hometown Wuxi in Jiangsu province, has been superficial, but like you said, it does provide an avenue to touch on China's cultural identity, at least for a younger generation. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And maybe I can close actually with this other image from Picturing Global China, actually, which is the end of my book as well. In which the artist Lu Jiajia, who's a young woman artist from Shanghai, took a lot of photographs in and around the city, including of places that were set up for demolition.
This thing on Shanghai. All these photos, wow.
I know, they're amazing, these photos. Yeah, it was dozens of contributors with photos from all over China. It was really amazing. But speaking about this issue of local identity and culture and design and loss, this photographic series by Lu Jiajia are, as I said, taken around sites that are slated for demolition. And then she would go back and photograph them 10 years later, and then you see, a big high rise in its place. And she wrote poetry that accompanied these images, and I translated for the Picturing Global China book this phrase, which she writes about this. It says, as a city pursues rapid economic growth, it ignores ecology, environment, history, culture, and local architectural styles. In the moonlight, I approached them, missed them, growing quietly near, embraced them. Today, gently touched by their sorrow, I'm feeling their seclusions. My heart feels so Yeah, and then I just go on to say, it's a widely held notion that translation inherently registers loss. There's the oft-cited Italian wordplay, traditore, which translates to translator, traitor. And yet we continue to translate, and I think this is very important, because the alternative to shut ourselves off from languages or cultures which we don't readily understand may and has, I would argue, resulted in nationalist isolationism and the halting of cross-cultural communication, generating losses far greater than the translators' betrayals. So I certainly believe that in artworks, as in these photographs sent across seas and translated texts and cosmopolitan cities, there exists the potential for sharing diverse perspectives in and of our shared world.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. Those were
Thank you so much.
beautiful words to close this program on. Thank you again for leading such interesting conversation. And
thank you. Thanks for everybody for coming. And I would love to be in more touch with you, those of you in the USC community field, feel free to contact me through USC Roski School, Jenny Geelin at usc.edu.
thank you. And everyone who participated and joined this conversation, thank you. I hope you're doing well. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you again for joining this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.